Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is María Ibáñez, a professor and former dean of the School of Economics at the Universidad de los Andes. She is at Yale as a Rice Visiting Professor and Senior Fellow at the MacMillan Center. Professor Ibáñez's research studies the economic consequences of internal conflict, in particular the costs of war and conflict on the civilian population. Today, we'll talk with Professor Ibáñez about the 52-year war in Colombia, the peace process, which has just begun, and the post-conflict challenges it may face. Welcome, Professor Ibáñez.
Thanks, Marilyn, for the invitation.
Let's begin with kind of an overview of the situation in Colombia today.
We are in very interesting and exciting times right now in Colombia. After 52 years of conflict, the national government and FARC, the oldest and largest guerrilla group in Colombia, signed peace this Monday. Besides committing on the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration to civilian life, the peace accords have provisions for promoting access to rural land and rural development, promoting participation, political participation for former combatants, eradicating illicit trade, drug trade, and also restituting victims, as well as creating a transitional justice tribunal. So it's big challenges ahead, immense challenges ahead. And we are hopeful, but we also know that the challenges are big and that we need to prepare for them.
How did the peace talks come about?
It has been a really long process. Although the war has been on for 52 years, it really intensified during the 90s due to illicit drug funds. Basically, the illicit drug funds intensified the conflict and amplified it throughout the geographical territory. And the worst years of conflicts were in 2001, 2002, 2003. By that time, each year we had around 400,000 internally displaced persons. And parallel to this intensification of the conflict, what we had is that the government invested huge resources to strengthen the military forces. The US government supported that process through monetary resources, but more importantly so through intelligence and technical support. So starting around 2006, the government, the national government and the military forces were able to exert major military blows to the guerrilla. So they were isolated again in their traditional strongholds, and that, I think, set the incentives for starting the peace talks. But we have been in peace talks for many years. In the 1990s, the M19, a guerrilla group, and other guerrilla groups demobilized. In 2006, the paramilitary groups demobilized, and now FARC follow suit. So we have been in almost like a 30-year process of trying to broker peace.
You mentioned internally displaced people, and it's a mind-boggling figure, 15% of the population, correct? And when you say internally displaced, internally they were displaced in other areas of the country, or they left the country?
No, it's internal displacement is within the geographical borders of Colombia. So the 7.4 million people does not include refugees. But mostly it was internally displaced people going from rural areas of the country to the urban areas of the country because of the war and the intense violence against the civilian population.
I see, and now that peace has been brokered, what will happen to these people? Will they be able to simply go back to their hometowns, or it doesn't seem to be that it would be that easy since the war has been going on for so long?
I think that most of internally displaced persons will prefer to stay in the urban areas. In some research that we have done, applying surveys to internally displaced households, they express that only 11% will be willing to return to their hometowns. I expect that will change as violence eases and as land starts being restituted to the displaced population. But most of them will continue in the urban areas. What we have found in this study is that For example, female-headed households are not willing to return. They prefer to stay in urban areas where health and education services are larger and are of better quality. We also found that people that were heavily traumatized before displacement are not willing to return. So mostly the people who will return are formal landowners and agricultural workers, but let's say it's about 30%. It would be anyways 2 million people.
Right.
So it's going to be a big challenge to promote the return of 30% of the population, and the government would have to provide support for the return process, but also to create income generation opportunities, to restitute land, to insert them again into the social networks that they used to have in their hometown. So it's a big challenge as well.
Yes, yes. You had mentioned the drug trade, and I imagine you mean cocaine specifically, and that had been such a big influence on the conflict. Do you think that will not rear its head again? How will Colombia keep that at bay?
Cocaine trade will continue, even after the conflict ends. Cocaine trade is not a cause of conflict, but is basically it has helped the conflict to intensify and to amplify throughout the geographical territory. Cocaine trade is mostly because it is illegal trade. It has huge profits for the people that participate in illegal trade, and it's also the cause of a very ill-designed policy, international policy to combat illegal trade. So that will continue after the peace ends. To halt illegal trade we really need an international policy to change. The so-called war on drugs has had immense cost for the Colombian population. A lot of people have died, and it has been vastly ineffective. So a study that was done by Pascual Restrepo and Sandra Rosso, 2 Colombian economists, showed that to eradicate 1 hectare of coca, you have to fumigate 30 hectares of coca. So you see how vastly ineffective it has been. So we hope that it will change, but I'm not very optimistic that that will happen.
Do you foresee any change in the politics of the country in terms of who is running the country, that kind of thing, with the peace process moving forward?
I don't anticipate that would happen. FARC are not very popular. They were a very aggressive guerrilla movement. They killed and victimized a very large percentage of the population. They might be able to get elected in local elections of the peoples of the places where they were strong. And that's very isolated regions of the country, but I really don't anticipate that we will have a shift, for example, to a leftist movement in power in Colombia. I think there is a long way ahead. One of the consequences of the conflict in Colombia, of the long conflict in Colombia, is that the population is very right-winged. So I think that's not very easy.
Now, an election is coming up next week, correct, in Colombia? And the election is what will the election decide? Or a vote?
It's going to be the 2nd of October. And it's a plebiscite. And the president was not legally binded to call for a plebiscite to support or not support the peace accords, but he decided he wanted to submit the accords to the will of the people. So the purpose of the plebiscite is to say whether the population is going to support or not the peace accord that was negotiated with FARC. It's not a referendum. It only has 13% of the registered to vote population have to vote the plebiscite in order to be effective. But it's an important process because the president needs the popular support.
Sure. And it kind of legitimizes what he's done. I mean, do you anticipate any issues with the vote?
Well, the country now is extremely polarized because of this process. Former President Uribe is against the peace process. He's campaigning against the peace process. So there's going to be, the polls show that there's going to be around 20 to 30% of people not supporting the peace process. But I think the main risk is that we don't reach the threshold that the plebiscites need in order to be effective.
And what happens if the people don't support, what will happen at that point?
It's completely crazy because basically it's not legally binding. So the president would be able to continue with the peace process and the peace accord can be implemented. But basically what would happen is that he will lose the popular support to continue with the peace process. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the peace process is going to fall.
So it's going to be a very interesting few weeks coming up, I would say.
It's interesting and it's stressing, yes,
Right,
because the
right.
population is very polarized.
Right.
So,
So what are going to be some of the biggest challenges in the event that the peace conflict moves forward? I mean, the peace, the peace process works and is moving forward. What are some of the biggest challenges, do you think?
well, there are several challenges. First, once the peace accords are approved through the plebiscite, which I hope it will happen, it will just be the first step. That doesn't mean that we will be in peace. It will take several decades. The first one is that the peace accord is ambitious, and it has to be implemented by a state that has been weak in the first place.
Right.
So the first important challenge is to strengthen the Colombian state, which is not going to be an easy task. A second challenge that I think is important is that we are undergoing through fiscal pressures because we depended heavily on oil prices and the oil prices dropped, so fiscal resources are lower at this time.
Sure.
Another important challenge is that that we will have, the political participation is going to be difficult. We had a peace process in the 1980s with FARC. It was not successful, and it was not successful because many of the people of the FARC that were participating in politics were assassinated.
Oh.
So it might well be the case that the paramilitary groups that are still around in the country may try to destabilize the situation through assassinating the political representatives of the FARC.
Is there any indication that that is something that could possibly happen?
There are indications.
Yes.
During the last years, around 60 community leaders have been assassinated.
Oh my goodness.
And these are leaders that have been pushing for land restitution, for example.
Right.
So the risk is there. And I think that's a big challenge. That's an immediate challenge that the government has to face on how to guarantee the life of the people that are demobilizing, and that's important.
Now, I know the vote is coming up, but is there any indication prior to the vote that the population is supporting this peace, want to move in that direction, are tired of the conflict?
Well, you have the polls, and also there is a process of the population doing a lot of demonstrations, especially young people who are going out and showing the support to the peace process. And it has been massive in some cases. A lot of demonstration marches going to the public spaces to show support, artistical things, but I think the vote may turn out to be low. The number of people voting might be low.
Would they be afraid to come out to vote? And it's the same, similar with the demonstrations. Are people afraid to come out and demonstrate or vote? No, there's no
Not at
backlash
No.
for doing that.
Not for demonstrating. There are not backlashes for that. Most of the demonstrations are in large urban cities in Colombia, and you really don't have the presence of these illegal armed groups in the urban areas as strong as in more rural areas.
Right.
So there is no backlashes for that. The backlashes and the violence is mostly in the rural areas where the armed groups are present, and when some military and drug dealers are still present, who benefit from war, and who would prefer that the war continues.
Right. So, what do you think the future holds for Colombia?
Well, I'm hopeful. I am from Colombia and I live there. But we have a big task ahead. I hope that the first years after the peace agreement that has just been signed are going to be difficult, are going to be risky. We have to ensure that violence is not going to erupt again. We have to protect former combatants of FARC, so we don't have political assassinations, and we really have to protect all this process. So I'm optimistic, but I really think that the risk and the challenges of conflict reverting again are still high. Right. There are other two groups that have not demobilized yet, the ELN, which is a smaller guerrilla group, and criminal bands that were former paramilitary groups. They are still active, they are still present throughout the territory. So we still have a few steps really to reach peace. Right. But I'm very hopeful, very, very hopeful.
Right. It is important, I think, to remain hopeful and to keep trying, of course.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you, Marilyn, for the invitation.
For more information about Professor Ibáñez and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.